In the previous video, I showed a PCB which I made for a Coleco Vision controller. In this video, I'm going to describe the actual case which I've built for it using a 3D print. And I also discuss getting the 3D print made at a PCB manufacturer in China as well to get a better quality one. This is just a draft print. I'll discuss why this is a draft print as well. And then after I've shown inside the controller itself, I'll go over the design in FreeCAD and describe how it's actually put together in FreeCAD. So as shown in the previous video, I've got a test circuit here which I'll use again just to test it while it's in the actual case. And I've actually hardwired these two buttons. So in the previous video I discussed how I had the chip select and the read button so that I could actually test out how the chip select works on this chip. But I've actually hardwired those now so I can switch between keyboard and joystick on here. And it's currently in joystick mode, so the keyboard doesn't do anything, but the joystick will work fine, and the fire button 1 for the joystick works on while it's selected for the joystick. Fire button 2 doesn't work because it's on for the keyboard control. So if I switch over to the keyboard, and now you can see the buttons on the keyboard. There's 12 buttons and they all send the appropriate code for that particular button press. And so fire button 1 doesn't work, but fire button 2 does. And the joystick of course doesn't work when it's selected for the keyboard. So I've 3D printed the case on my printer, but it's only a small printer. It's a DaVinci Nano and it's got a very small print bed, which is why I've had to cut this top case and the bottom case in two in order to print it. And at the end of the video I'll show you how to cut a model into two so that you can print two parts of a big model on your printer. And it's also in draft mode, so you can see it's quite rough the way it's printed out. And that's because it takes ages to print on my printer, and you can see some Pritt stick on the bottom where I used it to stick to the bed so it doesn't warp as much. But it still gets a bit of warp. You can see here where both those ends are touching and it's kind of warped a bit in the middle. So I want to send out to a Chinese PCB manufacturer that does 3D printing and see what kind of quality comes back with the 3D printed case from them. And when I send out, there's a number of different kinds of filament that they can use, and I would select ABS when I send out because it has quite a high melting point. With PLA, I've had PLA models in my car and sort of behind a window in my house, and whenever there's direct sunlight, it's quite strong, they can actually warp and deform. So whereas ABS it's a lot higher melting point, so hopefully it shouldn't actually melt or deform. And it's the same material you get in these kind of boxes that you can buy in electronic shops that do that you can just put your kits in. So and I've never had an issue with one of those boxes melting, so that should be a lot better. So I hope that whatever comes back from the PCB manufacturer is a lot higher quality than obviously what I can print at home. And even on these buttons here, I've actually had to use a needle file because when I 3D print on my printer in draft mode, it kind of overshoots and you get little round bits on the end, on the corners. And so I've had to use a needle file just to clean these up a bit in order to get them to fit in there. And that shouldn't happen on the on any model I buy from a PCB manufacturer. I'm hoping it'll be really good quality. But I'm surprised even on my print at home how accurate the going from KiCad to a case design and then putting the case around the PCB, how accurately you can get it. You know, there's very small clearances here around the actual controller port. So it's a really impressive process using all this free software like FreeCAD and KiCad to actually produce one of these things. So I'll take the model apart and have a quick look inside. So there's a knob on the joystick which just threads on there. I used I think it's an M8 tap in order to create thread within this 3D printed knob, and so I've got an M8 bolt there which it just screws onto. And I use screws in the back here to actually put the back on. I'll only probably need to unscrew these top 4 in order to get the top case off. I use self-tapping screws, so when I watch some other people's videos and when they produce 3D printed cases, they seem to use threaded inserts a lot and use a soldering iron to melt them into the PLA. But actually you can get these self-tapping screws, and that means you don't need a screw and an insert, you just need the screw. And on the 3D print you just create a post which take this off without the buttons falling out. Just create a post which you can then screw the self-tapping screw into. You don't need to tap a thread or anything. It'll create its own thread in the actual post. And you can see here I've got the buttons, each one put inside its own little like guide, and there's a little lip on the edge of each button so it doesn't fall out. You can just place them in there, and they just push down on these 6mm buttons that you get in other cases. This is where I've cut the model in half, so, or well, not in half, but in little bits, so that I can actually print it on my small bed of 3D printer, so that they still work on the buttons at the bottom there. And I've just used like an M8 bolt in order to do the joystick, and the washer which pushes down on the switches at the top, which seems to work okay. I mean, it's not the best of mechanisms, and I think it could probably be improved on, but let's see how it goes when I actually get the actual system up and running. And then the fire buttons are on the side there. So I use a thing called FreeCAD to actually design the 3D printing model for the case. My project for the controller is here. So if I double click on this file, it'll open up FreeCAD. And FreeCAD is part of the standard Ubuntu distribution for Linux, so you can just install it by typing apt-get install FreeCAD. And so the project displays itself here, and you can like rotate around it and zoom in and zoom out and things. On the left hand side here are the objects within this project. So I've got the PCB. So first of all, we start off by designing the PCB in here, and you can do that straight from taking dimensions from the KiCad software. So when you design the PCB itself in KiCad, you can get the dimensions for the PCB and the items which are on the PCB, like these switches, and place them on there. And if you do that in FreeCAD first of all, then and work around that, then you can get the design out in very few iterations of actually doing the design. And so I've done the case base, which goes below it, and so you line up all the screw holes and everything that you want to the actual PCB which you've modelled, and you can see the actual D-sub connector at the end I've modelled as well, so you can see how that sticks out and how it looks. And I've got the case top, which I've modelled as well. Now I'll go through an example of how to actually design something in FreeCAD after I've just gone through sort of this project file. But this is kind of the basics of how you lay things out. And so I've done the key which goes in there. And although it's the keys are the same for all of these, just design one key, and then when you come to actually print it, you just print out like 12 of those keys. And the fire key, which is in the side of in that side there. So if I select and deselect, you can see it appearing and disappearing. And you go through the whole case like that, and just like lay it out. And then when you actually come to want to create a file for printing, so I wanted to create the top file, the case top as a file for printing. You just type click in File and Export, and you can export it as an STL type. So that's what my 3D printer takes, and so the case control top is what I've saved it as .stl. So you just save it like that, and it only saves the one you've selected. So you can then select controller base and then export that as well. But that's a good thing about the software, is that you can design it all around the PCB and then just export the bits that you want to actually create the 3D prints. So if I come out of FreeCAD, and I actually use viewer software now to actually just take a look over it. So was it control top? I think I just exported. And I use this what's it called, View 3D Scene software, and it just allows me to look at the STL file just to see if it looks all good as you sort of move around it. You can zoom in, zoom out, and just to see if the exported file looks like you expect it to look before you go and print it. So I'll demonstrate in FreeCAD how to create like a simple model, and it's basically all based around the same thing. What you do is you have this menu up top here, and you want to select part. So this menu just selects which of these toolbars you get displayed, and the part one gives you the geometric shapes and be able to add and remove shapes. So you click on new for new file, so that down the bottom here you've got like the start page and this new file that I've just created, and these geometric shapes on the left hand side of what you create all your bits out of. So if I create a cube and just zoom out of it a bit and rotate it, and if you select the cube on the left here which you've just created, and then you can make, say, the length 50 long, and then these buttons up here center what you've just done on the display. And then if I wanted to create a cylinder, do the same kind of thing. I select the cylinder. I want to make it 50 long again because I'm going to make it the same length as the cube which I've just done. And what I want to do is I want to actually rotate this now. And the rotating is a bit complex. So I want to rotate it by 90 degrees. It's not obvious now how these X, Y, and Z's work, but what I usually do is take away the Z, and then you can usually do what the rotation you want with the X or the Y. But if you add the Z back in, it goes off at a strange angle. You go at 45 degrees. So you really just really want to be able to do it with the X and the Y. And so what I want to do now, I'm going to demonstrate making a kind of a radius on a case. So on the cylinder, I want to make the actual the radius diameter bigger, so that I can cut that. So what you do is, now that I've created the cube and the cylinder for making the radius, I select cube first, and then hold down shift and select cylinder, and then there's a cut tool there. So if I click on cut, it cuts the cylinder out of the cube. Now what I want to do is make another cube and say this is my case. And so if I click on cube and I make it 50 long like it was before, but this time because it's my case it's going to be 50 wide. Well, actually let's make that 20 because that's more like height at the minute. Then 50 high, just to make it simple. And what I can do is I can select the cut and I can move the cut up onto the top right. So if I just center that on the screen, placement, and if you click on the X and Y, you can use if you've got a mouse wheel, you can use the mouse wheel to move around on the actual shape rather than just typing in the figures. Move it up to that corner there, and then I select the cube first. So whatever you want to cut out of, you select first, and then select what you want to cut there. I cut that, and you see I've got a radius there, which is what I've put on the actual controller case, and it makes it easy to hold when you've got like a radius on the corners. And you see it looks a bit funny view, so you can change the view into, I think it's orthographic view. It makes it a bit, and it's the other one. It's the perspective view. It makes it a bit easier to look at when it's in perspective rather than orthographic, because it doesn't have the it doesn't like have the perspective of going backwards into the display. So that's a simple example of how to actually use FreeCAD. So another thing I was going to show was how to separate a model into two parts so that you can print a large model on a small 3D printer bed. So you need Blender for that, and so if I open it up, and on Ubuntu you just type apt-get install Blender because it's part of the standard distribution. And I'll select the block that you get by default and hit delete because I don't want that. And then on the file menu you can import the STL file. I just find the one we've just saved, which is the controller top, and use the mouse wheel to zoom out and put everything on the single plane by clicking on the Z here, and that way when you move things around it stays on the XY plane, it doesn't drift off the base. if I hold down shift and drag the middle mouse button, I can drag it around the screen as well. And if you hit tab now, it goes into edit mode, and press A just to make sure everything's selected. On the left hand side there's tools down here, and on the knife tool hold down the left button and select bisect, then drag across the model at the point where you want to actually bisect the model. Try and make things reasonably vertical. Press V to actually separate things, to make the cut, but don't move the mouse at this point. You have to press enter first, because if you move the mouse it drags things around. But once you've hit enter, you can move the mouse around fine. Then press Ctrl L to select half of the model, and press P to actually do the separation, and it gives you 3 options, and do the selection option. Now the model is in 2 parts, so if I hit tab again to come out of edit mode, now I can select one half or the other half of the model. If I just zoom out, so to move the model around now, or the bit that you've got selected, if you press R to rotate, you can actually rotate that part of the model, and click to actually drop it. And then you can also move around by pressing G, and then you can just drag around where you want the part of the model to be. But there's an extra bit you need to do as well, because where you separated it on both sides, you'll see that the actual model is hollow. So you actually have to create a face on that part there, because you can actually see into the model there. So just bring it into the middle of the screen here and put it in a kind of vertical sort of view, because I want to be able to select half of just the points around that face. So if I hit tab again to go into edit mode, I just want to select the points around that face. Oops, I need to select the select box tool. So hopefully just dragging and selecting that face there. If I press F, it should fill in that with a face, but it hasn't done it properly, so you have to, unfortunately, sometimes if it doesn't do it as you want it, you have to actually zoom in and do things manually. And what you have to do then is select parts of the model like this and press F, and that creates a face across that bit. And unfortunately it's a bit of a laborious job to actually just create faces across the bit of the model that you need across here. But you do that and you fill in that face, and you're going to need to do that on that part of the model as well. But once you've done that, you just click on File, Export as STL, and then you select the file where you want to go, and I'll show you the one that I've saved of this model. So I saved it under here, test.stl, when I 3D printed mine. And so, oops. So there you are, you can see that I'd filled in the faces there. But it's a bit of a tricky job filling in those faces, but sometimes you get lucky, and if you drag across those points and just press F, it will fill it in for you. But that's how to do it anyway.